Hello and welcome back to the shop. Once again, it's Mike. Before we get into whatever it is that I'm working on, which is probably obvious that it's what's in front of me, please hit the like and subscribe and hit the notification button down in the corner to help support my channel and to get alerts when I put out a new video. Hello and welcome back to the shop. Once again, it's me, Mike. Today I'm going to walk you through the build of this little guy right here. This is actually a replica of well, at least a section of the wall from inside Hominoptera from 1999's The Mummy, starring Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz. If you'll recall, not to give away spoilers of a nearly 30-year-old movie, but is it 30 years? 20 years. 1999. Yeah, 1999. I was 19 when it came out. That's how old I am. Anyway, if you'll recall, the really nasty character, the warden, who got a little handsy with Rachel Weisz in the prison where O'Connell was kept, played by Brendan Fraser. When they first go into Hominoptera, he crawls off on his own and finds a wall covered in little scarabs, these little guys right here. He pops some of them out. One of them falls on the ground. It turns into a big giant bug, crawls in through his foot and eats his brain. That's pretty much a synopsis of what these things are. You see them earlier on in the movie, or excuse me, you see them later on in the movie during the performance of the Hom Die on Imhotep when they dump a bunch of them into his casket. You see them later when a couple of the other characters encounter them, and then they sort of become a big bad later on in the movie as Hominoptera is collapsing. And the character Benny gets eaten by them. Well, you don't see that on screen, all the lights go out. But at one point, and now a couple of weeks ago, a good friend of mine gave me this. This is a casting from one of the original props from the film. Now, this casting is about 20 years old, and he wasn't entirely certain exactly where it came from or what its lineage is, but he does know that at some point this came from one of the production molds, at least a couple generations back at the latest. So there is some lineage to these. This is exactly what they looked like. You never really get too many close-ups of them. But this is what they look like as they were popped out of the wall. Now, as soon as he handed me this, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I love that scene, mostly because it's just pure ridiculous, but also because I just really like the look of that wall. And as soon as I got it, I made a mold of it, and I cast a bunch of them from Smoothcast 300 by Smooth-On. I went ahead and I made a bunch of these, and I chose the 5 best ones and produced this. And I'm going to walk you through how I made this, what it's made from, and how to get these paint effects with this stuff. Now, when you see them on screen, they're largely blue with a little bit of green or purple hues to them, depending on the lighting. And I wanted to replicate as much of that as I could. And I discovered the Plaid FX Armor Metallics series of paints. And I just used these 3 colors to attain these different paint effects on here. And they worked out beautifully, and I'm going to show you how I use them, and I'm sure there's a myriad of different ways to use them. But the Plaid FX series of paints are awesome, and I've had a lot of fun experimenting with them here as of late, and I'm going to continue experimenting with them on other projects coming up in the future. So sit back, relax, and I'm going to drone on about how this was made. This is one of the Scarabs from The Mummy, 1999. This is cast from one of the screen-used originals, when the scene where the fella's popping him out of the wall and he drops it on the floor and it turns into a live scarab and eats through his foot and eats his brain. This is one of those scarabs that he pops out of the wall. I want some more of these, so I need to make a mold of this, and I went ahead and made a mold of it. Because I need about half a dozen of them, I went ahead and cast them out of some Smoothcast 300, and this one needs some trimming, but that's how they come out. And I went ahead and took the liberty of priming them. Put some foam there, and now I've got all of them that I need. And the reason that I needed so many is because that wall section that he pops them out of, I wanted to make a replica of that, which I've done so with some pink insulation foam and just carved out some spaces for him, add a little bit of detail to it. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to paint these up using Plaid FX, their Armor Metallics series, and try and get the little color transition that they used, or that they had, and then also paint this up to look like a section of the wall, merely just because I want to display this. So I do not know who made the original mold for this. I got this from my friend Greg, and he wasn't sure of the history of it either. This casting is, according to him, nearly 20 years old. So it could be that these came from the original production mold, but comparing this to one of the actual screen used Scarabs, it's dead on. So I don't know, this may be only maybe one generation separated from the actual production molds. So, but again, I'm not sure. I don't even know what the material was that was used to make this one. I know these were Smooth Cast 300. But I'm going to go ahead and paint these guys up and paint up this board here, this section of wall from Hominoptera, and make a nice little display for these props. Let's do this. Need some paintbrushes first. I'm going to start out by putting a base layer of black using the using the Plaid FX Smooth Satin Black, and I'm going to actually mix it with a little bit of the Armor Metallic Samurai Sword. Interesting name for paint, but so be it. Now, the reason that I'm doing this is because I want a nice metallic background underneath all of this before I put the base layer of color down, which a lot of them on screen appear to be a base blue, but they do a bit of color transition in them. So I want to have that color transition, but to do that I need to have a base layer of color. And now this stuff is relatively thick, so it needs to be thinned down to get a nice even coat, because you don't want too much of it, because you'll end up filling your details in, and you don't want to do that. Water to thin these out. I tried using alcohol to thin it out, and it doesn't care for alcohol too much. Just get a good even coating over the entire thing. There's not a huge amount of surface detail on these things anyway, but what there is, you don't want to fill in too much, so you don't want to leave big globs of paint anywhere, as I leave big globs of paint. More or less one down, do the rest. Okay, so that's all painted up, ready to go. That's just Plaid FX Black and the metallic Plaid FX Samurai Sword mixed together to give a nice mottled metallic under effect. It's a bit of grayish, but that's perfect for what we're about to do. Now I'm going to be using a non-Plaid FX color now, Brassy Brass, which is one of Vallejo's game colors, to just basically dry brush the whole thing and give it a nice coppery tone, or bronze. It's actually more of a copper color than bronze. And I'm just doing this in a relatively sloppy way just to get a decent coating of this color on here, because this is actually going to help the other colors pop out a little bit more. And when I say other colors, I mean the Plaid FX Metallics series. I'm going to be using 3 different colors on this. I'm going to be using the purple, the blue, and the green. They all have different names. Emerald, something that's bluish, and something that's purplish. I can't remember their names right away. I'll put them on screen so you can see what they are. But yeah, do this decent coat of Brassy Brass or equivalent color to get the effect that I'm going to go for. Now, all of the different Scarabs that you see in the film, they're all slightly different colors, but they're all sort of a color changing metallic. There's some that are predominantly green, predominantly blue, and predominantly purple. And I'm going to try and duplicate those colors to a degree. And then of course the gold trim all the way around, and we'll get to the gold here in a bit. So there it is, all coated in copper, or brassy brass, whatever you want to call it. Now the method I'm going to use, I actually kind of half learned from Steve, my man Steve over at SKS Props. He did a great video about painting an all foam and foam clay beetle that he made using these Plaid FX Metallics. And I'm going to kind of copy off of his method a little bit. His is on a much larger scale than this, so I don't need to go into as much detail. But I'm also going to weather these to look ancient and dirty. So go over to SKS Props and check out that video, which is actually kind of pretty much inspired me to do this. So go over and check out Steve, my man Steve over at SKS Props, because he's super, super good maker. And yeah, I've actually learned quite a bit from him. So I'll leave the link in the description below for that. But now let's put some color on this fella. And because I want this guy to be predominantly blue, I am going to make his base purple, which should make no sense, but it actually will, and I promise that. So what I'm using is this Plaid FX Armor Metallic. And it is, oh, what's the title for this one? Eris. Yeah, Eris. Okay, I'm not sure how that... Well, you know what, though? That doesn't make sense, because purple was the color of royalty, because at one time purple dye was the most expensive dye to make. So, just... I'm avoiding what will be the predominantly gold areas of this. And I don't need a thick coat of it. I just need the base color purple down towards the bottom, because we are going to be actually fading this quite a bit. And one thing I won't be doing is I won't actually be cleaning the brush out in between layers, because I don't need that. I need this to layer up. So... And this paint is actually relatively thin out of the jar, so you don't really need to thin it out, but if you do decide to thin it out, you can just use water. I've had good luck with that. Don't use alcohol, because it actually makes it grainy. At least in my experience it does. And then paint his head. The tusks, whatever you want to call them, mandibles I suppose, since it says ostensibly an insect, they remain gold. And we'll go back and redo the gold after we get this, his basic colors on, or hers. I'm not sure what how the scarab species worked, but basic Shado purple. I might actually clean that out of the brush a bit, because there's a lot of paint in that brush. It's an unnecessary amount of paint, actually. I've run out of a paint rag. Crap. Shop towel. Now this paint is actually still wet, but we're gonna get some of the blue, which this Armor Metallic blue, and it's called Saber Blue. All right. Start in the center, because we're gonna work our way out, and just blend it all together. And now some of the purple will show through, which is ideal, and the gold will also come through as well, because this paint is actually fairly translucent, so you can get a good blending effect and almost a color change effect with it. Smooth that out. And now I'm actually going to let that dry for a little bit. So be right back. Okay, so that's guys dried for a few minutes. So let's put on another layer of paint. See those bubbles right there? That's what happens when your paintbrush isn't dry enough, which mine wasn't. I still had some liquid in there, so I'll have to sort that out a little bit. Don't worry about getting too much on the gold or brassy brass part, because we'll go back over that here in a bit anyway. All right, let that dry again. All dried up-ish. Well, dried up enough. You don't need it completely dry for this. And now the last color in our pantheon is the Armor Metallics Emerald. It's the other way. Emerald. All by Plaid FX. Now I'm essentially going to just dry brush this on here. So I don't need a huge amount of paint on, because I just really need to catch some highlights. I'm really just going after the high edges of the model and then blending that in. It's got a nice subtle color change effect now. And that doesn't look too bad. I'm happy with that. And I don't need to go super detailed in with these or overboard with the paint job, because it's all going to get crudded up. Now you can actually, with just these three colors, the emerald, the Eris, and the, what was the last one? Saber blue, that guy, and that guy. You can make a whole bunch of different color combinations with them, because with just these three, I managed to make 5 different scarabs that look more or less different. Now, all of these shades are slightly different, and it's all just going in different orders with these 3 paints. Base of purple, base of blue, base of green, and then stepping it up from there depending on which direction I want to go with the coloring. Now that the scarabs are done, we'll do the gold. Now remember, the base of this was Vallejo Brassy Brass from their Game Color series, and now I'm going to use another one from their Game Color series, which is actually Glorious Gold. And then we're going to go through and catch up highlights and do a little cleanup with it, and then these will essentially be done. It's a fairly simple process to paint these things. So, uno momento. So that's all picked out now with Glorious Gold by Vallejo. And now we're going to weather it. And to weather it, I'm actually just going to use some watered down burnt umber from Vallejo and do a simple wash over this. And it's about 1 part water to 1 part paint. And just do a simple wash over it and then dab off the excess with a paper towel. That's it. That's pretty much the extent of that. And I'll let that dry. So this is just a piece of 1-inch insulation foam, just the pink insulation foam. I took an X-Acto knife and carved out rough equivalents of where these things would sit, and because they kind of all sit in a little bit of a oval bowl shape, and those are relatively deep enough for what I'm doing. And I use sandpaper to smooth it all out. These I don't necessarily need to smooth out because they're going to be covered up, but I kind of gave it a little bit of texture here and there with sandpaper. And now I'm going to give it a base coat. And the base coat that I'm going to use is once again Plaid FX, and it's going to be the flexible acrylic paint because it's what I have on hand, and I'm just trying to use as much Plaid FX stuff as I can. And this is the Racine Grilli or Charred Root, which is just brown in all actuality. I think I have an open one already. I do. I have one that's already open. So I'll use it. And I'm just going to apply this in a very, well, relatively thick layer. So brown paint as a base layer, and just apply it very thickly, but not bigly. Now I could prime this stuff with some foam primer, but for what I'm doing, it's not necessary. And based on some of the screenshots, the still shots of this, like this one, you can see that the base color of this is a brownish tint. It's not like it's sandstone or anything, which I imagine it's supposed to be sandstone, perhaps for the area. I don't know what the common stones are in that area of ancient Egypt. I should probably look into that, shouldn't I? But I'm just trying to mimic that color as much as I can. The base appears to be a brown, and then we'll go through and do some washes on this and highlight this after this brown dries. Paint the edges black, glue some scarabs in. Bob is your uncle. I have found that with this Plaid FX paint, you don't necessarily need to prime certain types of foam because it will paint right over it without the need for primer, and it looks just fine. I've not painted this pink insulation foam before with it, so I'm curious as to how this is going to come out. Get good even coverage across the whole thing. Cover up all the bits of pink, because that's just going to ruin the whole thing if I have a bunch of pink foam showing. Make sure to look at it from numerous angles, because you could always have little hidden bits of foam showing through. We don't want any foam showing through at all. The edges will be painted black once I'm done with this, so I'm not concerned with them. There. That'll do for now. Come back when this dries. Now I went ahead and I sprinkled a little bit of pocket sand on this guy just to give it a little bit more texture, and we'll put another not so over the top layer of sand, of brown on this, just to sort of incorporate that sand into it to give it a little bit more oomph, if you will. There's not really any good close-ups that I could find of the wall that these were popped out of, so I'm kind of having to guess on the up-close texture. But I think this is a fairly close equivalent. That'll do. That'll do, pig. That'll do. Now for the highlight color, I've gone ahead and I've mixed together some desert sand, the brown, and then a little bit of the yellow, all Plaid FX. And I'm going to make a bit of a lightly colored sandy-ish highlight texture, highlight color. Basically, I'm making tan. That's what I'm doing, is making tan. And that's the color you end up with. And this I'm just going to be dry brushing across the top very, very lightly and sort of mixing it in with the brown, which is actually the base brown color, is still slightly wet. So that'll allow me to blend this quite well. And we'll be going in all directions eventually, but we'll just start with one at random. All right, that's a start. Lightening it up a little bit. And let that dry. Now earlier we did a burnt umber wash on these Scarabs. And I've taken that burnt umber wash and I've mixed it with some Vallejo black and just basic black. And I've turned that into a wash, which I'm going to thin down to make even thinner. And then I'll give a nice wash to this entire thing. And then other than some weathering powder business, I'm going to call this thing done. And then we can start putting in some Scarabs and paint the edges black and put it on a shelf. Call it a win. So thin this out with some very, very dirty water because who cares? It's black. Now I'm going to be dabbing this as I go because I don't want it to dry at all. I want to pull up as much of it as I can as I'm going because I want the effect of aging without ruining any of the other paint. Never wipe while doing this, always dab. And make sure you don't have gold paint where you can track it into it. Well, that's ruined. Clean as you go, unlike what I do, which isn't that at all. That was an oversight. Now I've got some pink coming through. Did that too soon. Well, it looks like I am going to have to go back and repaint. But no sense stopping now. So I guess we need to fix that. It'll give it a nice mottled effect, I suppose. There, the crime's hidden. Now I can go back and re-weather it a little bit, but there's a lesson for you. Make sure you don't have a whole lot of excess paint laying around that you could drag through your piece, and also that you don't get in a hurry, because you'll end up ruining the work you've already done and have to go back and do it a second time. Here endeth the lesson. All right, so that's all dried up, or at least dried up enough. Now we'll go with the old friend to my weathering powder. Again, number A. We'll start with some sand. This is going to take a while. We'll just go ahead and skip ahead. We need to get some PVA glue on these. I'm using PVA glue to put these down, just regular old white, basically Elmer's glue, for lack of a better phrase, because it will dry clear, and any other glues could be too caustic and end up melting the foam, which I don't want, because at some point I may need to pull these off of here, and I don't want them to have foam melted to them. So if you see a little bit of white glue in there, that's okay, because once it dries, you won't see it anymore. There we go. All 5 of them in place. Now we need to let that dry. So there you have it. That is how I went about building this replica of the Scarabs and Wall section from 1999's The Mummy, starring Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz. I hope that this video was entertaining, perhaps even informative. If you want to find out more about Plaid FX, you should check out the links below in the description. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you have any questions, leave a comment below. Tell me what you thought of the video. And if you would, please consider Patreon to help support my channel. All those links are below, along with all of my other social media, to see what other projects I'm working on and what other projects may be coming in the future. Once again, thank you again for watching. Cheers.